Hi, POIs in chat, preferably, please. Panel. Currently, the global financial system was infected with US hegemony, that despite the cosmopolitan veneer of institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, be under no illusion they were directly proxies for the interests of the US. The US had determinative voting rights when you needed 85% or a majority that was substantial in order to pass lending packages, and the US had 15 and 17% essential veto capacity on every single lending decision. We think that in this debate, we're going to be able to prove to you that irrespective of how these bodies form, we think they will be good in and of themselves because they likely promote mechanisms of growth that are more compatible with the fundamentals of these economies. But even if you don't buy that analysis in this debate, you are going to buy that the presence of an alternative allows these countries and prospective creditees to be able to leverage that alternative to be able to actually negotiate for packages that are not imposing Western liberal hegemony upon them, that do not come with that same degree of cultural imperialism. I'm going to bring you 2 points of substantive in this speech. One, on why there was a good economic impact when they had the presence of these bodies. Secondly, on why we combat hermit economics in the world. On that first point, and before that, I just want to note a couple of things in setup, which is that firstly, there is an existing amount of skepticism and anti-colonial fervor towards institutions like the IMF. Those were things like in the Sahel, where you had people rejecting French presence and rejecting those types of things insofar as they were continuities of colonial oppression. Secondly, I would note that the current macroeconomic conditions necessitate some degree of action. So there's going to need to be some alternative that is different than before, noting the insufficiencies that have been noted when the IMF goes in and imposes high amounts of austerity, when it imposes market conditions, when it does not allow them to engage in the same kind of protectionism of key industries that Western states did do in order to develop, but now hypocritically says that they cannot do that in these countries. Secondly, what is this likely to look like? One, we think they operate in a similar capacity to the current bodies, so lending, aid, financial packages. Secondly, they probably do some consultative work as well in a similar way that the IMF does. We think their funds are similarly derived from like private and sovereign capital. They probably do want to make returns, so they do have like profit incentives overriding them. First point in substantive then, why is this a good presence within the global south? I think the first thing to note is that they are likely to be better organizations. A couple of reasons for this. One, because their economic philosophies and their philosophies of growth were more compatible to the fundamentals of these countries. That was to say they supported things like export-driven protectionism and growth. They rejected kind of neoliberal logic that said that you needed to adhere to market conditions. You needed to like have severe levels of currency depreciation that meant that importing goods into a country was prohibitively expensive. I would note that when the IMF goes in and imposes austerity, it is not only bad for the economic conditions of the now, it is bad protractedly, because when you make it so hard to import core goods for your country, note the fact that you engender all of the things that are bad for democracy. You make people incredibly angry when they cannot afford bread. You make people lose faith in the democratic system in that country in and of itself. You erode the legitimacy of those organizations, particularly in the context of nations like the Sahel, which are key to coups and like kind of political takeover and illiberalism. We think it is important that you keep strength and keep faith within those democracies. So note that as an independent impact that is going to exist outside of the economic clash that exists in this debate. The fact that austeric measures that are just a key part of IMF conditionality are likely to engender anti-democratic norms, violence, coups, military takeovers. All of those things are independently bad because they kill people, but they are also destabilizing protractedly into the long term. I think the second thing to say then in this debate is the fact that oftentimes the interests of these organizations are fundamentally in tension with the interests of the people who are creating and are going to receive the impacts of that. I would just note the fact that the US obviously has a very different composition of its economies. The triggers that necessitate the US to change its interest rate or engage in certain types of monetary policy are very different comparative to like the global south, where you primarily engage in primary sectors, where the types of economic conditions and shocks you respond to are likely to be quite commensurable. I think that means in this debate, firstly, you have less reliance on the US. That is to say that when the US has to do things like increase its interest rates and has currency appreciations, the repayments on the loans that are denominated in US dollars do not skyrocket such that you literally have to go into debt distress. But secondarily, you much more likely are likely to have collaboration and likely to have like synthesis and harmony in your ability to implement economic policy and planning insofar as they operate on similar contexts. That's just an easier thing to do. But I think the third thing to note in this debate is just the independent benefit. You now have the capacity to counter the asymmetrical power that these institutions have over small and nascent economies. That was to say that now, if the US wanted to give you a trade package, or if the IMF wanted to give you one, you could counter that with the offer that was happening with this other alternative body. That just meant you could probably reduce the amount of austerity on net. You could probably argue for better conditions. Note the extent of how paternalistic and patronizing the IMF had been in certain instances. It literally looked like in Turkey, telling them what time their bakeries could open. That was incredibly inflammatory to anti-colonial sentiment within these countries. It was incredibly bad and likely to be incredibly paternalistic and done in a way that was negative for growth. So note the fact that there was empirical evidence for this too. The way that the US had tried to counter China's presence in the global south with its own trade corridors like the GIS and increasing presence in Africa and development there. So on net, just believe that you have better bodies in themselves inherently because their growth stories are more commensurable to the actual context they operate in. They're likely to do lending to other countries that are good. But secondly, note that their very existence as an alternative allows these countries to have a degree of leverage. Before I get into the next point about why you combat hermit economics, I'll take a point from closing.
China also practiced a very bad action, things such as debt trap against other countries. How exactly that's better on your side?
Debt trap diplomacy is such a myth. Honestly, that's 10 years, that's so many years ago. We don't think that China is engaging in perverse debt trap in a way that is materially different to the way that these organizations operate. Yes, China is a big bilateral lender, but it literally just goes in, offers them money and has some some types of conditionality, but they are always going to be less stringent though than the IMF that has a entirely different neoliberal philosophy of growth. Firstly then on combating hermit economics, the first thing I would note here is the fact that oftentimes anti-colonialism was a big thing, and the regimes that come in as coups oftentimes derive their legitimacy from combating the ways in which South Korea had, despite frequent economic crises, did not take any loans from the IMF or any trade packages from them because they were so scarred from the things that happened in financial crisis that they experienced when they took IMF loans. But thirdly, just note the fact that the type of imperialism we're talking about is incredibly evident, it's incredibly stringent, like what I tell you happens in Turkey. I just think that means that for illiberal democracies or for electoral autocracies that are kind of teetering on the edge of democracy, they probably disengage and are likely to, in the future, disengage from the IMF. I think there are a couple of impacts of that. One, you don't get any liberalization that occurs from increasing economic engagement with the financial system. Why was it good to just have them taking aid packages, just have them engaging in bilateral trade negotiations or multilateral trade negotiations? One, because when companies go in, they want good, strong judiciaries because those are the things that allow you to have contract enforcement. Discuss the benefits for everyone in that country when the courts are good. Secondly, they care about human capital in a way that was independent of the democracies. They wanted to have people who were good for their laborers. They wanted to attract talent. That probably was reasons why you check the benefits for economic growth. Even if we don't prove these bodies are good, they are a good alternative, but they are likely to be better than the existing IMF.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech, Prime Minister. Now calling on LO. Here.
Running in 3, 2, 1. I think it's incredibly problematic for OG to come out and deny the harms of things like debt traps and to fail to see the coercion and deep harms of countries that do engage in such acts and do engage in human rights abuses across all the developing nations and their own minority groups. We think what ends up happening with these alternatives, if you end up having less oversight over problems like corruption, and you end up having worse outcomes for everyone. So what we hear from OG so far, I feel like they haven't really proved why the West are such a horrible actor. I'm going to deal with this even more later. But even if there are certain harms of relying on the West, we think these harms essentially are still symmetric and if not more harmful to these people. I think fundamentally, there are other countries like the ones in BRICS, for example, China, India. We think a lot of them do have sort of behaviors that have been proven through a lot of past atrocities that they are likely to abuse others, or they are likely to also want to flood other countries with their goods. They're likely to force others to privatize, likely to force other countries to pay back at incredibly high rates, and that this austerity is not exclusive. I'll prove to you why it's worse on our side. So why do we get a whole lot worse oversight over problems, and why do we basically fuel even more corruption and negative outcomes. So I think a lot of these countries are like overwhelmingly like not like very democratic countries. We think first you have a lot of authoritarian countries like China, Russia, and India who have autocratic national governments, who have like authoritarian leaderships that in of itself means that there's more likely to have like you're likely to have behavior that have a human rights record. We think they care less about them and the general well-being of their people, like especially including minorities such as the Muslims upon like this country. And I think that they make sure that you have to because in dominance, although like potentially like it's so just gains, which means that you also allow more like corruption. You allow people to go through because there are less checks and balances, which means like at the end of the day they get into unfavorable like deals with the BRICS alternatives. So we think a lot of these countries themselves also don't necessarily see the issue with corruption, which is also why they're less likely to have those sort of checks and balances against them. And we think like in contrast, like organized aren't adapting to like anti-corruption sort of measures. Okay, so what do the countries look like? I think there are a lot of smaller nations, for example, or a lot of like developing nations or ones that are like non-democratic themselves. We think they'll buy in because you get that less oversight. It means that they can have those short-term gains because they want to like basically uplift their economic status at the moment. I think that's like, I guess, one of the pressing issues. But the problem is like if they don't think about the long term as much, they just want to have a whole lot back. For example, we think there are problems like this in the past, such as the high-speed rail initiative in Malaysia, where they had like a very unfavorable deal for them. And then when the actual auditors came in, they realized that it was like really overpriced for them and they had to end up pulling out. We think like what the alternatives look like is creating a lot more projects like this that will exploit all of these other countries. The reason these countries like really will go into is like that, like how long necessarily they'll be in power. They want to get these they want to like have that economic brief, which some of them democratic countries or more corrupt countries may involve like those governments actually wanted to pocket some of the money themselves as well. So we think basically you just have this whole loop of people who are likely to end up exploiting like more corruption, less money to the people not being able to basically all their taxpayer money basically going to these things. Before I go on, I'll take a PR from
So BRICS consists of 5 countries plus 11 countries. Do you think China dominates all the discussion?
It can, yeah. But so I think China, whether or not it dominates, all of these other countries are likely to have the same viewpoint in which they allow those sort of fast, unfavorable deals to go through. Other impacts, we just think at the end of the day, a lot of these, like you end up over the long term harming these economies. They won't actually have a long-term good GDP. It like basically affects all the whole like well-being, it's that quality of living of the people there. It also means like less sovereignty in future. I think that that is incredibly detrimental and we're so proud to oppose.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes to both.
Okay, thanks. Give me a second, just drink some water.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the first thing I'm going to do in my speech is give a bunch of mechanisms as to why other countries, not only BRICS, but currently in the future, are going to join BRICS and get greater accountability for BRICS. And noting that like anything CG runs is going to have to be contingent on proving that not only BRICS can do good, but also that other countries have incentive to join. Then I'm going to respond to OO's deeply uncomparative case about debt trap diplomacy and explain why debt trap diplomacy is not as bad as the IMF's austerity stuff. And then I'm going to talk about bring you a unique substantive about why decreasing reliance on the US currency is an inherently good thing. Okay, firstly on framing, what did we tell you? I think CG correctly points out in a POI that BRICS is not only consisting of like Russia and China, it's also Brazil and like all of South Africa and Russia and India, right? Which means that inherently there are going to be greater checks and balances within BRICS. But I think now I'm just going to give you a bunch of mechanisms that we gave at Sierra, proving why future countries do have incentive to join BRICS. Firstly, as we noted, things like increasing IMF skepticism, things like anti-colonial narratives means that all these countries that have been screwed over by the West in the past have great incentive to join BRICS. Secondly, looking at the macro and microeconomic failures of the IMF and things like that. I think the third thing to know here, which I'm going to expand on, is that these countries do want to decrease their reliance on the US dollar and all of those things. And I also just want to note that, like, empirically speaking, there are a lot of countries that do want to join BRICS. It's not just BRICS itself that's like going to be the thing, but also, for example, in July, the Algerian president set aside $1.5 billion to join BRICS. Egypt, Arabia, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, these are all countries that have flagged their incentive to join BRICS, which is directly clashing with OA's substantive of why, all these countries don't want to have anything to do with BRICS, because it's so incredibly harmful. That's just not true when other countries are planning to join. Okay, now I'm going to directly respond to OA's clash with our material. What did they say? Basically, we just ran the basic, debt trap diplomacy bad, stuff like that. A couple of observations to make here. I think the first thing to note is that they never directly engage with our points on austerity. Like, we told you at Sierra that China has an inherently different economic philosophy than IMF and all these other Western institutions. That is to say, China supports deficit financing. They support giving out development loans and things like that. Compare that to the IMF and like the Western banks institutions believing in market-driven growth. Instead, they've never made that direct comparison as to why that's necessarily better. But I think the second thing to note here is that they never prove why debt trap is like so much worse than IMF's conditionality, noting that China wants to strengthen their ties with the global South. They want to increase their benefits like long term with these countries, right? I also want to note here, like, I think this debt trap argument is like quite xenophobic insofar as China has to spend huge amounts of capital to do this in the first place. It's deeply unclear why it's such a huge benefit to China to like get collateralized infrastructure in 100 years. What China wants is like greater trade deals with these countries and stuff like that. It's not in their incentive to screw over these countries when they're investing with them in such a long term. Okay, now I'm going to talk explicitly about all the stuff that now I'm going to talk about like why we just need to get better economic philosophy and things like that, noting that even if these countries like don't join BRICS, or if they aren't necessarily going to engage with BRICS all the time, why is BRICS existing an incredibly good thing for countries that do want to do this? I think the first thing to note here is what we said. We've got very little response. Things like greater counter offers, which means that countries can, for example, if BRICS offers a loan or the IMF offers a loan, they can indirectly leverage that against both of these institutions, meaning that even if the country does like ultimately want to engage with the IMF, you're giving them greater leverage with this discussion in the first place. But the second thing we told you is that these countries are rejecting the economic philosophies of the West, noting things like, austerity measures and all those incredibly bad things. What do we tell you the impacts of this? I think the impacts of this, again, which got no response from leader of opposition, are just things like, firstly, greater destabilization and violence within those countries, noting the fact that austerity measures are deeply unpopular within countries that have been screwed over by the West in the past. This does lead to things like greater coups, greater anti-democratic sentiment, and all those incredibly harmful things. But I think the second thing to note here is that, like, at the point at which the IMF is the only institution existing, this means that autocracies who don't want to engage with the IMF screw themselves out of getting any aid at all whatsoever. This is incredibly bad insofar as we do want these countries to develop and democratize. And at the point in which you have BRICS existing as an alternative that they will take, the impacts of this are multifold, right? Like, firstly, you just get better trade deals, people on the ground getting food to them, and all these incredibly good things. But secondly, it means in the long run, you can do things like with a greater capital, improve a judiciary system. Before I move on, I'll take that POI from CEO.
If I don't want to go to BRICS alternative, what will happen to me?
If you don't want to take the BRICS alternative, now I'm going to engage, right? Even if you want to take the BRICS alternative, this is going to be really good. Okay, now on reliance on the US currency. I want to note at the top of this that the BRICS is already like engaging in this process, right? So the counterfactual that the opposition bench has to defend is BRICS like either peeling back this policy, which is incredibly is going to be like incredibly difficult, or this looking really bad. But even then, what am I going to say? My point here is that increasing that reliance on US currency is incredibly bad, as all these countries have noted. Why is it incredibly bad? I think the first thing to note here is that the US dollar constitutes 60% of central bank foreign reserves. That's incredibly harmful for these countries. Why? It means, firstly, in times of global crises, noting with the COVID pandemic, right, when the US dollar fluctuated and got really high, this meant that these countries, it was incredibly difficult for them to engage in trade deals, incredibly difficult for them to do things like repay their debts and stuff like that because of the incredible reliance on US currency. The second thing to note here, it's just that US politics are quite inherently like unstabilized. Like the Federal Reserve, for example, like decided to engage in incredibly aggressive rate hikes, which meant that domestic inflation for all these other countries relying on the US country increased. What changes on the other side of the world? I want to note here that BRICS sorry. I'm gonna get some water. I want to note here, new substantive, that BRICS are currently engaging and creating a new BRICS currency, kind of similar to like the way the euro functions. What this means is even countries that don't necessarily want to engage in long-term trade deals with BRICS, they can benefit from this. Why? Because I want to note here that at the point at which you're no longer having to rely on the US currency, when you can rely on a currency that's with other countries that are like localized to your area, that share the same economic philosophy as you, that share the same primary sector as you, this means that in times of global crises, making trade deals and debt repayments and all of those things is incredibly good, which is not only good for the economies macroly, but also very good for the people on the ground who we want to get medicines to and stuff like that in the crises. But I think the second thing to note here is, again, these countries just do get so much better leverage. Noting that right now, a huge problem with the US dollar means that the US is the only central point of, it's like a huge central point of failure, which means that if the US dollar or currency depreciates, this creates massive shocks for the rest of the world that aren't relying on the euro dollar. Now what we're doing is giving all these countries in the global south and in BRICS alternative, noting that this is happening already, noting that all of these countries, as I've listed before, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Argentina. Oh, at the end of this, very, very proud to.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech, DPM. Now calling on DLO. Here.
Oh, just doing a quick mic check. Everyone can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Very nice. Two questions in this speech. Firstly, will alternative economic organizations be more economically beneficial? And this will largely engage with the OG case. And secondly, which side has better oversight for human rights issues, corruption, etc.? This was the case Leidi provided to you. The first was on economic benefits. The main push coming from opposing government was two-pronged. The first prong was the idea that because America has an incommensurate neoliberal philosophy of development, it therefore cannot propose development strategies that are more beneficial to third world countries. However, China, which believes in beneficial economic development, and sort of not export-led development. They don't believe in, for example, import substitution. Therefore, they will not do this. Right off the top of this, I'd like to point out that China and India have massive manufacturing sectors that have economic incentives to export their goods elsewhere. This means that they have strong economic pressures for them to export these goods overseas. So if you believe that these countries want to have more economic influence within your countries and restructure their economies in the same way that the IMF does, presumably, it is likely that the economic incentives of these countries are likely going to be to flirt your markets with their goods, thus benefiting them. And note that in these instances, these are probably the countries that will dominate BRICS, because China is the country with the largest GDP in BRICS, much like how the IMF and World Bank are deferential to America because America primarily funds it. It is highly likely that any BRICS economic organization has to follow the same support structure. Otherwise, if they don't, then these large countries threaten to pull out the support. What this implies, therefore, is that the exact same liberalizing policies that countries are likely to be reliant upon if they join the IMF and the World Bank are going to be advocated for by BRICS or by any BRICS economic organization as well. That's symmetric at best. More, it is even great export-oriented. It's moving away to service-based industry. Negated. The second question then was on austerity and neoliberalism. They tell you that these large, powerful countries, like America, Europe, etc., do new imperial policies like austerity in order to force you to pay back these loans. Right at the top of this issue, I like to point out that there's no inherent reason why these countries want to do austerity. Like the actual reason why austerity is a thing is because if you want to get your loans paid back to you, you then need to force countries to adopt austerity policies to decrease their spending so they have enough money left over to then pay you. What this implies then is that the economic pressure for any given country which provides a developmental loan to do austerity is probably symmetric. But let's say it isn't, right? And you engage in what we then call debt trap diplomacy, the process of providing loans, not imposing austerity, and just hoping that they'll pay you back. What actually happens then is that these countries are stuck in debt traps. They end up having to pay back loans over a long period of time with great interest rates as a result. Why is this even worse than austerity? Sure, austerity sucks, but the reality then is after the period of austerity, what happens is these countries invest these resources in economically productive markets. They get enough taxation from these markets and industries, and then can then pay back these loans and then live austerity, the point at which they're economically developed and are able to pay back these loans and benefit their people. So even if we cut down on government services for a short period of time, we then restore these services later. The reality of debt trap diplomacy is you never get to that stage, because you're always stuck paying off more and more interest payments. Because of the way compound interest works, over an even longer period of time, more and more of your GDP ends up going over to these countries. That's why so many, for example, of your areas and territories within countries which have been stuck in the Belt and initiative of these loans. The second impact of this is because these institutions can start seizing territory that was placed as collateral. Look at the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, for example, which China seized as a result of Sri Lanka being unable to ever pay back its loans. Look at Sri Lanka's economy as a result of having to pay back massive loans, in large part to China and India as well. All of these economic collapses and these economic disasters occurs the point at which you are unable to push governments to take temporary economic pain and instead wait for the results to become more catastrophic later on. The reality then is that sure, austerity sucks. We can absolutely accept that premise, but either it is largely symmetric, or if it isn't, it also ends up spiraling into worse and worse stages of debt. The reality then is, although an IMF World Bank are not perfect, they're probably the least bad option in this scenario. The third thing they tell us is that they can play individuals off against each other, that the IMF and World Bank will be played off against BRICS. The question then is whether these differences are salient, right? Like presumably, if BRICS can offer you conditionless loans and you accept those loans, but I've proven to you that these loans are either asymmetrically bad because of the equal pressure to do austerity, or B, these loans that are presumably better just end up in countries' economies crashing in the future when they're unable to pay back these loans and investors start fleeing. That is not a good thing that you're playing them against each other. It's probably a bad thing. Before I move on, closing.
Yeah, so if Chinese debt trap diplomacy is so notorious as you say, what is the incentive of BRICS to actually follow the same path?
So I told you already, right? Like, look, like, think about it. Brazil is incredibly, unfortunately, it's not very rich, right? Like the vast majority of the GDP, they have to focus on developing their own country. Like similarly, all of the countries that PM mentioned, South Africa, for example, and South American countries are just not as wealthy as China. China has enough money and enough financial backing to spend money overseas and do all of the Belt and Road stuff. Everyone else can't. This is similar to why the World Trade Organization is dominated by America, because everyone else that doesn't have the economic resources as America does. The last thing I'll quickly deal with from their side is the currency thing. Like this is just not analytically linked to why we're debating, right? The reason why the US dollar dominates the world economy is because you have to buy oil in these dollars. That's why I call it the petrodollar. That's just symmetric on both sides of the house. Second question then on oversight. What did Leidi point out? Leidi points out crucially that the difference between BRICS and America, which we just happily admit controls IMF and World Bank, is that America has various forms of oversight. It's oversight by its own domestic populations, which are hesitant to associate with countries that are authoritarian in terms of their democracy or in terms of human rights abuses. like aware because of passing things like FCTA, because of scandals like the Watergate scandal, etc. The comparative is BRICS countries are often authoritarian themselves. They're rife with corruption. Look at Russia, China, and India, not exactly beacons of democracy. What then happens when these countries are providing these loans is that these loans are given without strings to adjust the human rights record of your country, to make more democratic institutions, and to reduce corruption. That's why your world leaders will buy into them, because they can do so without having to threaten their own power. This is detrimental to the people, because it means that the economic resources gained from these countries will A, never be paid back, thus trapping them in debt traps, but B, the short-term loans also don't go to improving your people, they go to lining the pockets of authoritarian leaders. The reality then is that, sure, we accept that the IMF has harms, but many of these harms are symmetrical, and the differences are all negative as a result. So proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much, DLO, for that speech. Now, moving on to the member of COP.
Can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear
okay,
you.
Thank you. One clarification before I move on to the extension. So IMF or World Bank or this new development bank of BRICS are not just, it's not, the functionality of these institutions are not just for giving loans and aids to countries, but it also influences monetary policies of participant countries. Look at IMF, where the IMF influences the composition of each individual country's foreign currency reserve by things like IMF SDR that mostly is composed of USD as well as euros, or things like surveillance mechanism internally on the participant countries, like monetary policy does exist, or things like they, oftentimes IMF advises each individual country to increase the USD reserve as opposed to any other currency, for example, Chinese yuan. The comparative is that I think that the BRICS, I want to note off top of my speech, the scope of our extension is not just constrained to the lending policy, but also extends to monetary policy, which is one of the reasons why our impact is greater compared to what we have. First extension, BRICS countries' loans and lending policy as well as monetary policy become far better, both in terms of quantity as well as quality on our side of the house. The first thing I want to say is that opening government's case is very uncomparative, because you know what? China has the same amount of capital and resources to be able to increase the soft power in countries like Pakistan on both sides of the house. The question is, under their side of the house, China spends all of that money on unilaterally and individually financing these poor countries and trying to get them into debt. By contrast, on our side, China uses this money to be able to finance on new development bank, which is this policy, which suggests that the comparative is whether China individually doing this or collectively BRICS doing this is a good thing or bad thing. Okay. So I want to know, under the status quo, each individual country or BRICS countries like China or Russia or Brazil are heavily engaging in very, very bad behavior in terms of lending as well as monetary policy. Look at China, where they give aid to without any condition imposed upon each recipient countries, or things like in terms of monetary policy, China artificially controls the currency exchange rate of things like Chinese yuan so that they can favor their own export-oriented economy, or countries like Russia that loans a lot of money to countries like North Korea, but imposes no condition whatsoever. And the consequence of that is that North Korea uses all of that Russian money onto and spend it all on the nuclear development program of their own nuclear weapons, right? Like all of those are incredibly harmful things that we see under the status quo. How does this change when BRICS as a collective do this? I want to note the first, in terms of the quality of the policy, it becomes substantially better, both in terms of lending as well as monetary policy. 3 reasons. Firstly, there would be internal accountability under BRICS organization. DLO says that DLO says China is going to dominate by bankrolling this entire institution. The problem is, one, India and Russia and Brazil combined, its GDP is greater compared to China, but also we know that recently China is facing series of financial shocks and like banking crisis and like over the construction projects, for example, or things like the economic decline in the future due to the population decline. And as a consequence, maybe India or Russia or Brazil might be small in economy compared to China right now, but the possibility of growth is far greater, and many countries know this evidently. But also we would suggest that many countries, like 11 countries, are joining BRICS at this moment. So if you combine all of those other countries, China is not the dominant one at this moment. I want to note that there would be internal accountability mechanism for the reason that within the BRICS, there are a lot of the internal political tension that exists. Look at countries like India and China, where they have huge border issues, right? Like literally the army fought off against each other, and there's still a lot of the tension and like trade war going on between these countries. And what does it mean? It means as a prerequisite of implementation of this policy, in order for India to agree to the establishment of the new development of this bank, what happens is that Modi has to convince to the conservative Indian electorates that we'll spend our taxpayer money to build this bank together with China. That means as a prerequisite of this motion, China has to give some kind of concession, otherwise India would never agree to it. In the same way applies to India and Russia or other countries that are fighting against each other and have internal political tension at this moment. Secondly, note that the forming a bank together required surveilling other countries, because in order for this bank to be sustainable, you need a consistent flow of money coming into this bank to be able to give it to loans. But the problem is that if countries like Brazil, if they overspend on their own domestic spending because they're short-termist leftist government, what happens is that you cannot sustain this bank anymore. That's why China or Russia or India has an incentive to oversee on the monetary and financial policy of Brazil and make sure that they're not going to overspend on the domestic spending and do have enough surplus money to be able to finance this bank. Thirdly, know that you need many countries to come in as a prerequisite of this global dominance of the BRIC countries. Like, you obviously don't just want authoritarian regime, as OG says, you want countries like Italy to come into BRICS as well. That means that you need to show that you are a responsible bank that is able to give a relatively good loan. And that's why the kind of policy that we're going to see is we're going to be more responsible, far more compared to the status quo. But also, in terms of quantity, we would suggest that there is a competitive incentive on BRICS countries to contribute more and give more lending policy to the new development bank to get more voting power, because Brazil previously had little to no aid given to other countries, but now Brazil have an incentive to lend more money or finance more to the new development bank to be able to have a voting power in these places. Okay. Next, I want to talk about is why IMF becomes substantially better, both in terms of quantity as well as quality. Under the status quo, the quality of IMF aid is actively harmful. Opening government have three mechanisms for this. One is the economic philosophy, but the question is, why can't IMF be rational and change their own economic philosophy? And two is this idea that US has different industrial composition, but I think DLO responds to this. Third is this idea that IMF is imperialist, but the only mechanism behind this is like example of Turkey. This is not a mechanism, this is just an assertion. I'm going to give far stronger mechanism than this. Three things. One, note that neoliberal economic consensus would continuously persist in IMF precisely because each individual development officer within IMF have a career incentive to rise through the ranks. That's why, because your boss believes in liberal economic consensus, you have to at least virtue signal that you believe in the same ideology to be able to get to the position of rank. But secondly, the main objective of IMF oftentimes becomes to get repayment, because a lot of the countries like US or China, US or Japan or European countries oftentimes, a lot of the times demands these like recipient countries to pay back their loans. And what happens as a consequence is the implementation of things like privatization as well as stringent conditionality. I'll just skip on the part and explain why the counterfactual is going to be good. Why is the establishment of new development bank going to change anything? I'm going to go beyond opening government's analysis of more leverage. Firstly, within the Western countries, we think that there is an inbuilt fear to the rise of BRICS country. In the United States, we see persistent anti-China sentiment. And India is seen as like the potential to become a global superpower in the future. And Russia is hated due to the issue of the conflict in Ukraine. That means that there is a political incentive for people like Biden, as well as many European leaders, to actively finance this, even if it comes at the cost of things like taxpayers' money, because if you do not take any action, you're seen as coward. Therefore, it is a political suicide. Secondly, note that there is an economic incentive for developed countries to finance more onto IMF, insofar as aid is a part of the soft power politics. So if many countries leave out of the IMF and move to this, that's an immense economic harm. Therefore, these countries have an incentive to finance the IMF for the better. For these reasons, both IMF and BRICS become better, far stronger mechanism compared to OG.
All right, great. Thank you so much for the speech, MG. Now calling on MO. Here.
Hi, can I check if I'm audible and visible? Is the audio clear?
Yes, to both. Yep.
First thing I want to do is position ourselves as closing opposition. The first is, I think, I want to answer the question that OG was pushing opening opposition. We'll be the first to actually do comparative of the worst cases within austerities versus debt trap. But the second thing I want to note here is just the missing linkage within opening half, which is what are the tipping points? Because OG says to a certain extent that the United States is bad, but opening opposition says that China is bad. But notice that all of their harms or benefits are still speculative at best until anyone actually proves this particular tipping point. The answer that we'll give under CO is the bigger picture picture for the trickle down that actually happens to the global economy and to the other global corporations necessarily will probably look like. Which means the only left with opening government, to a certain extent closing government swivel bullet, is just their mechanism on just the check and balance that happens within BRICS because they have a lot of like members, right? Two reasons to bring this down. The first is notice the amount of money that is filled within these economic like institutions. The majority of that particular like funds would always come from China itself. This probably looks like what's happening within the development bank necessarily. But number two, we think that the leverage would always be marginal or at worst tokenistic, especially for these smaller countries. And this goes beyond opening opposition's fact on just China being bad. What this necessarily proves that you'll never get that bargaining chip that OG necessarily wants, or neither does this actually answer whatever opening opposition wants to necessarily defend. We think then we'll answer CG's pathway on just protecting vulnerable states and just increasing memberships within a particular substantives. Nice. Framing. Two things, right? I think the first is that under CO, we prefer BRICS states to actually continue with their projects. For example, BRI or just development bank, right? What we're simply against is just BRICS creating this particular alternative, which means what government necessarily defense is the splintering of the membership. Note that if you buy their mechanisms on China being good, you also have to make the comparative under our side that necessarily other actors could also act within a benevolent way. We think what we actually defend is just probably things like accountability, having a counter narrative against US when you necessarily do not subscribe to like the particular institution's alternative that government wants to defend. Two extensions are bringing for today. The first extension is just on the hindering of the global economic development. And I'll give you a second extension on the toxic competition, the fragmentalization of global cooperation. First extension on just hindering the global economic development, right? Note that this particular extension proves and must weigh us above opening government because this is the particular impact that they necessarily miss, and also must weigh us above opening opposition because we're doing the comparative that is very much charitable to the government, which opening opposition never did. I think it's important to note that when you create this alternative on economic like institution, it means that you want other like members to also subscribe to this particular like alternative that BRICS necessarily has, which means you continuously have to give up on any forms of like agreements and necessarily you would have had with IMF. Two problems with this. The first is that BRICS operates in an exclusive manner only. So only the ones who subscribe to the agreement will necessarily get any form of help, which means comparatively similar to IMF, they would do the same thing against any of the BRICS alternative or any of the states that actually subscribe to this particular alternative. But the second thing to note here is that the harms on government shows a strong narrative necessarily to continuously leave IMF or the World Bank at the point in which you want to subscribe to the particular like alternative that BRICS wants. What this proves here is that countries will always have to pick and choose the particular actors that they want to work with. Harm here is that these particular countries opting, for example, these emerging countries like Brazil or South Africa would have never been affected by any policies within this particular debate because they're never afraid of losing such help from IMF anyway. But the problem here, panel, is that it doesn't work for other countries that are very small and rely solely on the IMF. Why is it unlikely for these small countries to actually, be able to compensate any of the harms coming under BRICS side? Firstly, we think IMF is deeply rooted within their economy. So it looks like giving up trades in the US, but also something that affects their whole monetary mechanisms within their particular country. But number two, it also just looks at the reliance on any forms of economical trade that necessarily comes exclusively from IMF. These are the particular things, the tipping points that they would always have to give up on. The outcome here is number one, you reduce or you split the economical alternatives into two, to probably BRICS or probably to the current IMF and the World Bank. Problem here is that the money fuel is all prerequisite to all the development that OG or opening opposition wanted to see. But the second thing here to note is that when they move out of IMF, it pushes smaller countries to also be abused. So two can also play the same game, right? Probably the US could always abuse these particular things, or probably in BRICS, China could also abuse these particular things, which means that you never actually have the better ends of the stick if you are within the smaller particular countries. Strategic conclusion here is that we're giving you the weighing as to how global corporations necessarily look like at the point in which any of these proposals under government or opposition actually looks like. Before I get to my second extension, I've got to take a pew.
Beyond the mechanism of competition we give you that touched upon, how do you prevent autocratic states from spiraling into isolationism? How do you get the liberalizing benefit?
Okay, got it.
So this brings me nicely into my second extension on toxic competition and the fragmentalization of global cooperation. Framing here is that notice that any of the benefits coming from government, and especially closing government, is fairly contingent on healthy competitions actually being within the interest of all these BRICS alternative, right? Notice that the reality under their side is always politicization and rhetorics being used used against all of these other nations that actually subscribe to BRICS or actually subscribe to any of the particular institution like alternatives anyway. The way here is that it becomes a battle of who has more rhetorics or who has more support, rather than it being things like A, development, or B, the aid via funds, which means under opening side or even closing government, they don't really solve any particular problems at the point which they do not want to take a trade-off of the bigger picture and the outcome that necessarily happens. This brings me nicely to my second premise on the fragmentalization of global cooperation, right? We think it's important to note that most economical crises are always going to be contagious because it will always spread to other nations. The comparative here is that it's unlikely for BRICS to then help any countries that actually was helped by IMF, which means that always development is going to be at halt. This engages with opening governments' reliance on US dollars, because you're not going to have any form of reliance at the point in which there is a form of crisis. This impacts three important things, right? Number one, it comes in terms of patents. There's no form of sharing within these particular states because you have essentially separated these two worlds into two. But secondly, we think it also harms things like technology and innovation, which is simply important for the access, specifically for developing countries or these particular third world nations. The third thing here is that you would never have proper arbitration if, for example, there are unfair trades happening on the ground or happening within these particular states. You are never able to actually become the arbitrator between these two particular contexts, because you would have never had the better actor within this particular premise, which means you will never have healthy competitions relying and on it being somewhat a lot more toxic and congulated. For all those reasons, it has to go to closing.
All right, great. Thank you for that speech. Now calling on Gov Whip. You're here.
Hey, POIs in the chat, please. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First comparison with opening government. There are a couple of things that opening government says, that IMF is bad, BRICS are good, and IMF policies in times of crisis, etc. There are two ways in which override this. First, we finally explain why the BRICS economic institution will be a responsible one. Because at best, opening government just says that there are more actors and it's just going to become more accountable. But how is it going to be accountable? Or why is it going to be accountable? This is the final answer that we give you on our side of the house. That's why opening government necessarily has to lose against the op bench, who continually has many mechanisms as to suggest why BRICS is not going to be a good actor. And this is the problem that we finally solve on our side of the house. There are mainly three ways we do this. First, we tell you about how there are, the fact that there are many past cases, as I suggested in the POI, there are some sort of reform is likely to happen because debt trap is not so notorious. We think that at the point where BRICS has incentive to actually have good deals, have appealing deals, this is at the point where improvement is significantly likely to happen. We also told you from member about why they have the capacity to actually improve because of the fact that all the capital that they have. But second is about increased accountability, and this just appears as a word in the opening government. But we explain how the fact that there are many actors involved in it actually leads to more accountability. For example, if China sees the post ports in the Indian Ocean as for example opening opposition suggested, this is at the point where, for example, India intervenes because India wants to stop and curb the influence of China within the Indian Ocean. This is a sort of multilateral accountability mechanism that we are likely to have. But thirdly, I think that BRICS have an obvious common interest, which is to increase global presence, and I think this is global presence. That's why I think that there's some level of compromise is likely to happen, and we also think that they are likely to differentiate with the IMF on how to make more appealing deals for comparatively developing countries. We think that these are we think through all these multiple reasons we prove to you why this is likely. But second, I think that we mechanize why IMF is likely to improve on opposition on our side of the house. Because in opening government, they say you're going to have a bargaining chip. But I think that we explain this far better, right? When we tell you about, for example, how political incentive in the West emerges finally because media would broadcast it and fearmonger the rise of the BRICS and say that the West is no longer relevant in the global stage. This is at the point where IMF finally has it incentive to reform. On the opposition side of the house, it's literally just IMF dominance or the debt trap diplomacy by China. In this context, IMF has no incentive to differentiate or improve itself because of all of the mechanisms about, for example, that we brought to you from closing government. The second, I think increasing membership to BRICS harms Western economic interests as they lose soft power. For example, in the status quo, France sends aid to Central Africa in exchange for favoring French companies. We think these sort of economic benefits are less likely to be it becomes significantly difficult to gain at the point where the West no longer has this sort of soft power. We think that BRICS will be identified as a real threat, and this is at the point where the reform mechanism and all of the improvement mechanism that we told you about is going to kick in. Okay, so let's compare then with opening opposition. Opening opposition in first is that we proved to you why BRICS deal is open. We are going to override reasonable one. We see comparative because on opening opposition, they just innocently assert that debt trap diplomacy is going to be the counterfactual. But we clarified on our member that the comparative of debt trap diplomacy is a comparative that opposition needs to defend. We think debt trap diplomacy is significantly less likely to happen on our side of the house at the point where China has to engage in this BRICS framework, and this is how we solve the problem of debt trap diplomacy on our side of the house. Second, they talk about, we're going to improve human rights issues through doing the, etc. But I think this is probably symmetric on both sides of the house to some extent. It's not clear to me why human rights issues are going to significantly worse at the point where probably the liberal regimes are going to exist on both sides of the house. Ethnic tension is going to exist on both of the house. Religious conflicts are going to exist. I don't see why this is actually going to make a huge difference. But second, I think that this doesn't really impact. I think that the most important thing is that these developing countries get the aid to begin with, and I think that this is a problem that we are able to solve when we have a better deal compared to the IMF. And the IMF also improves. Yeah, I'll take a POI from opening.
So it's not just about how big your economies are. It's about how much money you're willing to dedicate to overseas aid. The smaller economies, like Brazil, for example, often have to focus on BRICS will become a vehicle for China to continue its larger scale.
Okay. I don't think this is likely to be the case because of the fact that I'm not sure burden really leads to closing opposition winning this debate at all. Moreover, we provided you mechanisms as to how that is going to be solved, or how the BRICS are going to have a better deal, how the IMF is going to improve. We think these are the mechanisms we provided to you. We don't think this transitional harm emerges to begin with. Then they say they're going to opt out. The countries are going to opt out. I think that our extension is analytically prior because the US knows this risk, so they are likely to restructure IMF before countries are going to start leaving. We think this is the likely comparative that we have to talk about. Then finally, they talk about fracturization. I don't think this is relevant to begin with. Why does fracturization happen? You can still execute transaction between different economic weeks and different currency systems. This is the same as the status quo. Even if you lend from bank A, you can also lend from bank B. I really do not see why this sort of division is likely to happen. So all in all, I think we have the strongest mechanism that you can most confidently buy.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Gov Whip. Now calling on opposition Whip. Here.
Hello, checking am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. I'll go from opening. Begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Uji tells you the IMF is being controlled by the Western hegemony and they are very horrible. But I think they miss two important things. One, IMF and WTO and World Bank have been a lot of fire in recent decades simply because of the fact that of their failure that has been happening in the past, which is why they have a lot of incentive for them to actually reform, because the media keep looking at them and shows how exactly IMF are failing a lot of countries, but how exactly a lot of countries are literally threatening them that we're going to reduce the funding into IMF if you do not actually reform and actually change. All of these things prove to you why exactly IMF and WTO and World Bank are actually having a lot more information, which is why they stopped using the austerity measure when it comes to Indonesia, when they give the loans to Indonesia. The second thing that OG misses is that BRICS countries that exist within IMF holds a very powerful within whole strong power within IMF, which allows them to actually have accountability measure, which means that on that side of the house, if they want to argue about why exactly IMF is horrible, the reality is that right now BRICS can actually coalesce with each other and try to hold accountable and actually reform IMF. But more importantly is that the alternative, on that side of the house, the second that they leave IMF, what's likely going to happen is that you do not have a strong power to actually hold you as accountable. They may suggest that the new BRICS is going to be good, but the problem is that the countries who are going to live within IMF is going to be affected the most. They do not have any ability to hold US accountable. They do not have any ability to threaten US, which is why all those countries are going to be harmed. Our case is not contingent on IMF being bad or good, or neither BRICS going to be bad or good. I mean, come on, guys. It's 2023. Both are very horrible in nature, right? IMF is going to use their things and BRICS also going to abuse people. But we prove to you that even in the worst case scenario, what's likely going to happen is that if both teams, if both parties are actually horrible, our case is about how exactly once you separated this country into their own bubble, you harm the ability for you to be able to have proper funding in order for you to ensures proper development for all countries, but two, and more importantly, global cooperation, especially when there's an economical crisis. This is something that wasn't engaged by the Gulf Whip just now. I want to point out as well, because they never explained to us why exactly country will actually move towards BRICS, because they just assume that all countries will move towards BRICS. Let's assume, firstly, Sarah already explained to you that the reasons why a lot of countries are unlikely or feel like they do not want to move into BRICS, even though BRICS shows that they have a really beneficial benefits, is simply because of the fact that how exactly their economy already been in their IMF is so entrenched within their economy. The fact that Indonesia will not leave IMF simply because of the fact that IMF is the reasons why they're able to get out of economic crisis, which means that on that side of the house, what's likely going to happen is that it's going to be a small number of people who actually support BRICS is going to go to alternative. And the harm here is that if it's true that it's going to be a small number of countries, that means on that side of the house, that small number of countries are not able to access the benefits of the funding of IMF and the protection that IMF gave during economical crisis. All of these things harm their country. But in the worst case scenario, let's assume that a lot of countries move into BRICS alternative, then there will be still some countries who still stay within IMF. Those countries will be affected and will be harmed. Because if the argument is that IMF is bad, now they have no ability to hold IMF accountable, that country is going to be harmed as well. But what we argue is the realistic outcome, which is that it will be a 50-50 approach, which is IMF will get half of the world and the BRICS will get half of the world. This is where all the things will be much, much worse. Because on that side of the house, when you split the bigger power, that means there's no accountability mechanism within the country, which means that China are able to do that trap and able to abuse their pattern, all the patterns that will exist within their members simply because of the fact that there's no counter narrative that comes from the West to actually counter that. Similarly, US can impose all of their Western liberal democracy and whatever they want to believe in to all of those countries, because there's no China, there's no South Africa, there's no Brazil, there's no Russia that going to actually go against US within IMF, which means that you harm the ability. But more importantly is that this splintering also means that you lose a lot of resource and funding, which means that you're not able to ensure the development of the smaller country because the resources has been cut into two rather than all those resources being funneled into one country that can actually improve their quality of life. Let's be clear about a few more things. One, I want to point out that on outside of the house, BRICS can still function the same way as like all the things that they want to talk about. Things such as having their own currency, things such as like building their own like BRI and having their own project and stuff like that. All those things can still exist on outside of the house. Why is this important? Because this takes out the argument coming from OG about the currency. Because they say that US currency is very harmful. But on our side of the house, people can still opt into BRICS like currency even without going into IMF. The reality is that people are not only using like US dollar only, right? They also use other currency when it comes to trading, which is why this is not comparative. But if the argument is about why exactly BRICS give a lot of better like deals and agreement, all those things can still exist on our side of the house. But the reality is that they cannot actually do competition. And the reason is because this is not a trade agreement, guys. This is literally an international institution that you have to subscribe, and every single year you have to give funding. You cannot simply like, today I'm going to pick an agreement coming from IMF. Next, I'm going to pick a deal coming from a BRICS. It does not work like that. You have to actually commit to one. And even if it's not true, BRICS will force you to actually commit into one simply because of the fact that they're going to use the narrative, which means that they cannot simply use the argument about competition. What's likely going to happen is that people are going to force to pick one over than the other. That is why OG cannot win this debate with the argument of like competition is good. Before I move on, I'll take a PR from OG.
So you successfully symmetrically left CG out of the debate, but you have not dealt with our analysis about the unique group of autocratic states that never engage with the IMF. Surely some degree of trade liberalization and engagement with the international community is better.
What? Again, like if it's true that it's about autocratic countries, what's likely going to happen is that they're going to go into BRICS and you allow them to do whatever they want. The reason why we do not want to accept them, or the reason why we're pressuring them to change, is because those countries are affecting other countries. Autocratic countries are economically harming other countries, which is why we want them to actually change. Next, I want to argue about why exactly BRICS are actually being controlled by China. I think OO already explained to you, which is why CG cannot win this debate. But more importantly, what we explained to you is that the narrative that is going to be used by China, and the reality is that China will continuously say, we are the only reasons why you are able to escape the shackle of the US. Therefore, you have to listen to us. But more importantly, China have a lot of incentive to ensure that they're able to let all of these countries going to rely on China, which is why like China is going to control BRICS. Even if it's true that they have a lot of power on that side of the house, I think it's far better for them to use those power to actually hold IMF accountable and reform IMF rather than splintering them. But lastly, I want to explain, also I just want to point out that if the argument is about that BRICS have a lot of conflicts, that shows that BRICS alternative is not going to be efficient and therefore they're not going to get any of their benefits. Lastly, the liberation of the economy is actually inherently good because you allow competition to happen and you allow more money to go into a different country. I don't know why exactly they argue it's a bad thing. The imposition of patent law is actually inherently good because it prevents countries such as India and China from actually abuse their power. The only way for you to be able to ensure there's a better development worldwide is for you to actually come together within one institution and hold them accountable with each other. For all those reasons, it is clear CO is going through.
All right, great. Thank you so much for this debate. Thank you for that speech up whip. You may now cross the house like digitally. Please leave the room so that the judges can deliberate. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, can we have the recording stop?